Well, reading that quotation makes it. Are you feeling visceral pleasure yet? It sets the bar a bit high. Thank you for those readings of those poems. Wasn't that?
So tell us about your choice of poems. So tell us first about the Wallace Stevens.
It's a poem I love, and I'm not even sure why. For me, beginning to read modernist poetry, it seemed like it was about. I think when I was 18, the word I would have used was relativity. That there are a bunch of different ways of looking at things, and which in the time that would have written would have been 10 feet away from Broadway performers doing anything goes. You know, that idea at the time of if things are relative, there are different ways of looking at things. You could, so that was an opening in a way, and to me, though I didn't have a language for it at the time. But what I loved about the poem, I think, well, there are a bunch of things to love about it, but one is the clarity of mind and of writing. Among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird. It's what could be plainer. It's really just at the moment when the Western world was discovering Japanese poetry. Was a British diplomat named Basil Hall who wrote a little essay for the Times Literary Supplement called The Japanese Epigram. Just around this time that the imagism was becoming a method in modernist poetry. So there was that about it. And then it was evening all afternoon. Aren't there just lines you would die to have written? It was snowing and it was going to snow. The blackbird sat in the cedar limbs. I'm just in love with that.
Yes.
With that it wasn't even that I wanted to write like that yet. It was that I wanted to hold it to myself or something. And then there are the poems in it that are intellectual puzzles. A man and a woman are one, a man, a woman, and a blackbird are one. And then the humor. I was of three minds, like a tree in which there are three blackbirds. It's just so full of wonderful things and different things from one another. And the first puzzle that proposed itself to me was, what is the meaning of the blackbird? And I'm going to leave that for you guys to go back to. But a provisional answer is get out of the habit of looking for one meaning. So
and you were saying he's also a poet you keep coming back to when we were talking earlier on.
Well, I fell in love with Stevens very early, and for me, very early was a tumultuous period in American life that partly had to do with the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement at the time of the Vietnam War. And Stevens seemed a luxury because his poems are not historical in any way, and there's a level at which he doesn't deal with the problem of evil, which is the problem of how to behave in the world toward intent. My neighbor, this 10 years later, I moved to Berkeley, and living up the road was a great poet, Czesław Miłosz, who had lived through most of the horrors of the Second World War in Eastern Europe, where they were happening. And he, after the war, was briefly a diplomat for the Polish communist government in Washington, and he was supposed to send back reports on the state of American culture, and what he amused himself by translating Wallace Stevens to give them a sense of what American poetry was like. And he said, I'd like to be an American in which I could become a pedagogue of pears and write only about nature, sex, and death, and not have to deal with the destruction of Europe, the horror, all the rest of that. So to us at that time, Stevens seemed problematic because in the same way that it did for this European coming on catastrophe and saying, okay, among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird. What about the tanks? What about the bombs? What about human cruelty? It's not Stephen's subject.
Interesting. And the Gary Schneider?
Some
people won't know his work very much, I think.
First of all, he was writing about my world, the West Coast. So I don't know if those of you who are from here. In the United States, when I was a child, all books for children were produced in New York and Boston. And if you grew up in the desert in Arizona or in the Southwest or the lumber country, the Northwest or San Francisco, where I did, all the children went out to play in weather that had nothing to do with your weather. You know, they like the characters in the Peanuts cartoons, they put on their boots and they went out in the snow, which is what I grew up thinking real people did. So when I found that there were poets writing about my world, it was intensely interesting to me. And Gary Snyder was one of the first to do it, and he was also a person who was putting together at that time. I wandered into a bookstore in San Francisco, City Lights Books, which in the basement in those days, it was an avant-garde bookstore because it was the first bookstore in America that only stocked paperback books, which were an entirely new invention when I was in high school. And in the basement there were mimeographed magazines of all strange kinds. And I was a high school kid, I didn't know, but I knew that these people were a lot sexier than the people in my world. and there was a journal called the Journal for the Protection of All Being, and which I thought, that sounds like a project. and in it was an essay by someone named Gary Snyder called Buddhist Anarchism. And I thought about the fact that it had two words that I didn't understand. I didn't really know what anarchism was, and I didn't really know what Buddhism was. And I started to read this essay, and it was one of the things that introduced me to Gary Snyder. And then his poems, like this poem of the Western Mountains, this poem goes, burning the small dead branches, something from twisted white bark pine to Sumner from my part of the world. That means you're very high up in the mountains. This white bark pine is this little stunted pine tree that only grows about like above 12,000 feet. A little tree, it lasts about 100 years. If you're camping up there, which I did as a kid, you break off the branches and you burn them to make a fire. And he says it releases 100 years of snow melt, sun and air, hiss in a twisted bough. Again, like the Wallace Stevens, extremely clear, plain, no metaphors, no symbolism, just observant writing. A guy is doing this. And then he looks up at the mountains, Sierra Granite, Mount Ritter, which is an old chocolate-colored mountain in the midst of these gray mountains. Old volcanic activity. The old fires are the origin of the earth. Right there. Little fires, the origin of the earth. And then he says, Deneb Altair, which are two of the three stars you always see in the summertime in the mountains. And he looks, little fire that forged the earth, looks up at the stars burning. The Buddha supposedly said, Bhikkhu, everything is burning. And at the end of the poem he says, windy fire. And I just thought, whoa, just whoa. And it's a wow poem, not a why or how poem. It's really Wordsworth passed through a young Californian's understanding of Buddhism and classical poetry to make this very simple poem. And what I, over the years, have loved about it is that the shape of the poem is the shape of a movement of the mind. And that another thing I didn't understand is that it presupposed an attentiveness to one's own consciousness that made observing that movement a kind of like an ideogram of a thought, like a picture of a thought. I thought, oh, that's what poetry could be.
Fantastic. So you're introducing him, but let's introduce you a bit more as well. So I thought you could It'd be nice to hear a bit about you. You've written about your mother and your father a lot in the poems. But it would be nice to hear a little bit about the world that you were brought up into, your parents. I sound a bit like a sort of psychoanalyst, but I always want to say, tell me about your childhood.
Yeah. Well, I was born in San Francisco in 1941. Most people who live in California were not born in California, but I was. My father was. He came from Midwestern stock, German and Irish and English and Welsh, I think. German culture of the Midwest, really. My grandfather came to California. Or my great-grandfather, my grandfather born there. My father was born in San Francisco. My mother came also from German-Irish mix of people in Montana. One of her parents ran a dry goods store for Cornish miners in a Montana mining town. I knew one great-grandmother who spoke with a slightly German accent. I think they were immigrants from up around Hamburg, south of Hamburg, kind of the New England of Germany. Married into an Irish mining engineer's family in Montana. Kind of guy who wore General Pershing hats and jodhpurs and was always going off looking for gold in Alaska and Chile and other places. And so my parents met in San Francisco. I was born in March 1941. Is this interesting? It was. My parents tell the story that when I was, 6 months old, it was a winter day, sunny winter day on the beach in San Francisco, that people heard the news of the bombing of Pearl Harbor and looked out over the Pacific. My grandfather's house, which my father had inherited, sat 2 blocks above the main military base in San Francisco, right by the Golden Gate Bridge, which became the launching place for World War II in the Pacific. My parents, young, immediately in the crush, started subletting the upstairs of their house to generals. One of my earliest memories is trying to kiss a general's daughter I must have been 3 or 4 years old. I have memories of being under a piano with my mother playing songs in the room full of people in uniforms and parties of that kind. I had an older brother, younger sister, and then later another younger sister. We moved to the country, which was turning into suburb when I was 7 or 8 years old. My father had a business job. He became an expert on how to get large insurance companies to avoid paying taxes. He was a cynical man, a sweet man, but deeply cynical about his work. I don't think he liked it very much. My mother was took care of 4 children. Struggled with alcoholism throughout her life. I was talking in a workshop the other day and saying, everybody grows up in a family and is therefore, by the time that you're 8, you're already a haunted house. Every child absorbs every wish, fear, hope, dread. They experience them more keenly, we have them in our bones more fully than the adults around us who are experiencing them. So everybody has their own version of it, and it's a poet's hoard, that experience. It's what it's given us to mine in our lives, the forms happiness takes and the forms terror take. So mine in that way were pretty ordinary, middle class, not a lot of money, but we weren't poor. House full of books and music, not very good books. Book of the Month club books. My mother could play all kinds of music. I didn't hear any classical music until I went to school.
And was there any poetry in your childhood, particularly?
My Irish grandmother could recite lots of poetry. which I thought was something old people did.
People might still think that now.
My father was a tennis player, very good tennis player, and he wrecked his knee. And I remember her reciting Hausmann's to an athlete dying young.
Did that comfort him, do you think? So when did poetry enter your life, both reading it and writing it?
My parents subscribed to magazines. Well, let's see. What's the truth of this? Well, I remember. I remember writing verses, doggerel verses, in grammar school about my friends sometimes, and my parents subscribed to magazines like the Saturday Evening Post that had comic verse in it. And my brother and I wrote out in pencil comic poems and submitted them to the magazine, which never gave us the courtesy of a reply. And my grandmother could recite it, and I knew tons of song lyrics, as everybody did in those days. My parents' generation of songwriters were great lyricists, Cole Porter and Ira Gershwin. And I was raised a Catholic, so I had a ritual prayer, and I was an altar boy, so I had it in Latin as well as in English. So somewhere between popular song, Mother Goose, my grandmother's reciting poetry, I had my father liking the cremation of Sam McGee, those kind of Rudyard Kipling. I could recite those awful poems. Though I beaten ye and flayed you my father, though I beaten ye and flayed you by the living God that made you, you're a better man than I am, Gunga Din, just cringing empire poems. So there was all of that in my life. I remember reading a poem by Walt Stevens. I was in the 8th grade. I entered an essay contest. I've written an essay about this, so I'm quoting myself here. But I wrote. We were supposed to write an essay on why a book we read would make a good movie for some, and I wrote an essay about the fact that the book I assigned wasn't very good and wouldn't make a very good movie. And the nun called me up to the front of the room and said, "You're not going to win the prize." And it would make a lovely movie, because it would make a wonderful Walt Disney movie. There are seabirds laying eggs. And so go back and think about this some more. So I went back and lied and said it would be a good movie. And for my sins, I won second prize in the essay contest. And went into a bookstore with a $10 gift certificate, and there was a little book called A Comprehensive Anthology of American Poetry. And the word comprehensive made it seem so important that I bought it. And I went home and I opened it and I didn't understand a word in it, except there was one poem that was, I now know, by Wallace Stevens, called Domination of Black, which was his imitation of a French symbolist poem, or maybe of Poe. I'm not sure. And it's a poem. I have lots of his poetry by heart. I don't have this poetry by heart, but it went something like, as you sat in the room, the wind turned in the trees, as the fire turned the shadow of the wind in the rug, and you heard the cry of the peacock. Brenda, do you have it by heart? And the shadows came striding, just as the leaves turned in the wind, and the thing turned in the fire, and the dark leapt up. It was either the cry of the peacocks, a cry against the hemlocks, or the dark that came striding. Anyway, it went on like that, and it gave me chills, which was what it was supposed to do, that kind of poem. And that's my first experience of poetry. The Polish poet named Adam Zagajewski, I was quoting this to our workshop the other day, said, who has received the shock of love returns to the world with an altered face. And that moment of reading that poem for me was that. returning to the world with an altered face. I almost remember coming down the stairs after reading it. My mother and father and brother were sitting at the dining room table, and I felt like I was looking at them through the opposite end of a telescope. Mm. They looked small and far off because hadn't everybody had that experience at some point with a piece of music? Or mostly people have it with music, I think, that the world is transformed. It's a great moment of spiritual waking up or something like that. Indeed. So that was, I remember that. I remember kind of reading poetry in high school. When I was in high school, the Beats, Ginsberg and Snyder were in San Francisco, and that was, which eventually led me to sneak into the bookstores and to the bars where poetry was being read, and to come across a journal that had an essay in it called Buddhist Anarchism.
And when did you start writing yourself?
I wrote a little in high school, and I wrote a little in college. And in college, I met friends who said, I'm a poet. And in fact, when I was a freshman, I gave poems and short stories to the literary magazine. And the editor of the literary magazine, who was a senior and so seemed immensely old to me, read my poems and said, stick to fiction. So I kind of wrote poems and tried. Everybody was then trying to write poems. Everybody I knew was trying to write poems. And we were reading modern poetry intensely, reading Ezra Pound and reading Gary Snyder and T.S. Eliot, and the poets one read, and Auden, and the younger American poets. And it was really after I graduated from college and was in graduate school with no particular ambition except to avoid working in an office, and that I started writing poetry. And some of it didn't have to do with listening to the sound of Gary Snyder's poems, of hearing that you could write about your own world in a fairly simple and direct way. Was my brother also, who's an older brother's a doctor, but he was an English major. And I remember that when he switched to pre-med, and I was a senior in high school, he asked me if I would write his papers for him, or his Romanticism course. So I had to write a paper on Tintern Abbey, and therefore I had to read it, which I was problem, but I did. And the thing I remember about that poem is the line, at the beginning when he says, "Once again, I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, pastoral farms, green to the very door." And that was another, it wasn't like it, but it was, once again, I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines that you could correct yourself in a poem, that you could say something that sounded so natural and so fluent in a poem. Later, looking back, what I said to myself about these different experiences was that I was hearing someone tell the emotional truth for the first time in my life. Some of that I connected to my mother's alcoholism, that is in families, think Irish Catholic, think people lie, in families that have addiction problems, people lie about everything on principle, just to keep things loose. They'll lie about which is left and right, what time of day it is. None of it. My parents were very loving people. They were just struggling in their lives. They were completely kind to us. But it was terrifying all the time not to know whether you're going to come home to somebody who was smashed or not, and who's apt, therefore, to be committed to some kind of institution if that happened. And so it was scary, and nobody ever told the truth. There's lots of humor in my family, laughter, stuff like that, but nobody ever said what they were really feeling about anything. I'm blabbering, but I'm reading Colm Tobin's novel about Henry James, The Master. Wonderful. It's an astonishing book. And the way James is about, nobody ever says what they really mean. Everybody's always trying to infer what people really mean. That's another thing that a lot of childhood is like. It certainly was my childhood was like. So when I heard these poems, I felt like I felt I was home.
Mm-hmm.
This was, you were saying, we were talking, you were saying that somehow as soon as you became involved with Buddhism, you knew that
That was home.
that was where you were. That was what I felt the first time I really heard the music of a poem.
Mm. Mm. I mean, you've written very, very movingly about your mother. You talking reminds me of that poem of your father giving your mother, I can't remember the name of the poem, giving your mother medication which she had to take.
Yeah, there was, in the 50s, I guess, 40s and 50s, there was, I don't know if it's still used in the treatment of alcoholism, a pill called antabuse, which is one thing if you take it yourself, because if you know that you have the craving and I think AA is I don't have personal experience with this in my life, but I think AA is a much better way to deal with that than to say to yourself, if later I decide I'm going to drink, I know this will make me sick, so I won't do it. But that was, not only was it done, but it was I don't know what the compact was between them. I've written this one poem on this subject, and I feel like I've written 500 poems, and this is a poem that people talk about a lot.
Is it?
Because and I said, well, I have other subjects, But anyway, this my father would give my mother a pill. It was a pill called antabuse, and it makes you sick if you drink alcohol, and it must have been part of some compact of their staying together that she was going to take these pills, and she didn't like it. That she didn't say she didn't like it, but it's that thing, can you read what's going on in your family? So during some part of my childhood, I remember this thing, and there's been a lot of poetry in America about family life and about difficult family life, and it's got called confessional poetry, and that was so over by the time I wrote this poem. Right. I was at a time when my students would not be caught dead writing a poem about their family circumstance, and I found myself writing about it because I got interested in double binds, in the nature of double binds. I think it's one of the things that we all come out of childhood with. And there's an interesting psychologist, woman named Alice Miller, German psychology, who talks about the connection between depression and the double bind. That when you hit the places in your emotional life where you've learned very early not to notice what you're feeling, you go dead. If you want to find out the Saharas in your day, you've got to go to those places and find them and open them up. And almost always they have to do with the double bind. And in this case, the double bind, I'm supposed to identify with my father, who's our safe protector because my mom is very unstable, and my heart is bleeding for her. And whose side am I supposed to be on in this thing? There's a way in which one of the levers of insight is absolute contradiction. Just push it to the extreme.
Indeed.
So that was for me what writing about that experience was about.
Let's move. I want to move on a bit more to your being a poet laureate. You were poet laureate of the United States from 1995 to 1997. The Los Angeles Times Book Review described you as the most active poet laureate the United States has ever had. And you yourself called it an act of citizenship. I wondered what your vision for it was, and what did you mean by an act of citizenship?
Well, it's a very peculiar job. Being American Poet Laureate, it's a position inside the Library of Congress. It was originally called Consultant in Poetry to the Library of Congress. And the idea was to get some literary person in this library that was essentially a research tool for politicians, that's created by, in the time of the Franklin Roosevelt, and poet Archibald MacLeish was a school friend of his, and they dreamed up this idea of putting a poet in the Library of Congress for 1 year. So it was a like 1 year small sinecure in the 40s when it was created, and then some legislator from Oklahoma, not a poet or a professor or a literary person, proposed that the name really should be Poet Laureate, which Americans being fawning Anglophiles in many ways were then immediately thrilled. I think I was the fourth person to have the title Poet Laureate, and at which point it had begun to sink in that there was such a thing. And I was saying to Brenda, I felt like it was like being asked to be hall monitor at school or something like that. Like, am I so respectable that I got asked to do this job? And I had a vision of lots of receptions with cheddar cheese cut into cubes with toothpicks through it. It didn't seem glamorous at all. But I said yes, and then the next day there were television crews in our front yard. We were quite unready for. So suddenly there is this publicity. It's for 1 year. They give you a beautiful office right across from the Capitol in Washington. It's in this old building. You go up this Dickensian building and slip around there's this office where for teaching Spanish to diplomats, and it's the hallways full of books and papers, and you go around that and down some stairs and up some stairs, and then go into this office, and it opens right out onto the Capitol dome with a big glass window, and it's quite beautiful. But then you think, now what the hell am I supposed to do here? And so I thought up things to do. And I thought, well, for 1 year, I ended up doing it for 2 years. But I thought,
what did you do? Because you did a lot, didn't you? In the end?
Well, I did a few things. I started a few things, and over the years, I kind of wondered whether it changes your life, and that for a while, anyway, it gives you a kind of public role, and you're supposed to figure out how to do it. I went directly to the Washington Post and said, you should syndicate poetry like crossword puzzles and astrology columns. Thinking, and they said, well, we'll do it if you write a little commentary in each poem. And I said, no, I just meant you should syndicate, I could pick poems if you want for a year. I don't want to do it and you just make them available, and you're, after the New York Times, it's the biggest syndication in the country. And I also didn't understand at that point that people were just about to stop reading newspapers. So I thought, this is a really powerful thing. The internet was, in 1995, was just starting. But anyway, they said yes if I agreed to write a column, a weekly column on poetry. And I've never been very good about deadlines. And so I had then agreed to write a weekly column for a big national newspaper. And I did it for 4 years. And I never missed a deadline. And there was Skolnikov of deadlines. I skulked all through school, never got anything in on time. So that was one thing, was trying to get poetry out into the culture that way. The other thing I thought is, I don't want to go around talking about how great poetry is, because there's great poetry and there's bad poetry. It's like, is music good? Yes. Does anybody go around saying, isn't it great having dogs? But I thought literacy really mattered, and the turn toward the American version of Thatcherism, that we're still in the grip of, this terrifically anti-government, anti-tax resentment of paying for human services, meant that this, for reasons to do with the complexity of American taxation for education, schools were getting worse and worse and worse. And like Britain, the States is a country full of new immigrants, backwash of being imperialist countries, and it's hard to educate those kids if you don't pay enough money to do it. For some teacher to have Pakistani kids and Vietnamese kids and Algerian all in one classroom, it really takes work and it takes money. And the United States wasn't doing it, still not doing it. So I thought the useful thing for me to do would be to go around and say, first of all, you teach people how to read. So I did that a few times. I suddenly got many invitations. Is this interesting? I suddenly got lots of invitations. Put yourself in my place. It's like It's like the beginning of a Kafka novel. Here, you go be poet laureate. What does that mean? So I got one of the first invitations I got was to appear on the most popular children's television show, which the previous person who was poet laureate had done. And my impulse was, no, poetry's for grown-ups. And I don't want to do that. And I got an invitation to a downtown businessmen's club in Texas. And so I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to go tell them that their kids can't read. So I did that and people came up afterwards. I called somebody from the Department of Education at the University of Texas and said, what is the high school graduation rate in Dallas where I would be talking? And they told me. So I went there and said to the audience, after American Downtown Luncheon Business Group, they have a prayer, they have a pledge of allegiance, they talk business, and then they clear things for the speaker. And I said, can anybody here tell me the graduation rate from Dallas high schools? Nobody could. And I said, well, I can tell you. And I couldn't tell you from my own in San Francisco. I didn't know either. I don't blame you, but you don't know this. And here's the situation, and why aren't you doing something about it? If you don't do, who's going to do it? And I felt virtuous, self-righteous, eloquent, thought it was terrific. So I thought, I'm going to do this again. And I did it the second time, and I knew just what to say because I had said it, and the timing was just right, in another town. And then I got invited to a third place, and I said, and the third time I did it, I had become a politician because I was saying the same thing over in order to get the certain effect. And also I had begun to visit places where people were really working on literacy. Catholic Charity for kids in Chicago who dropped out of every other school. People working in a little town in California of mostly East Indian immigrant families. And I saw that coming in with a fancy title and giving a talk is not how you do this. How you do it is you go dig in someplace for 20 years and work at it and make a change. So it was an interesting experience, but it was not for me in the end doing that kind of campaigning.
Interesting.
So anyway, a picture of that job.
A picture of that. There's so much I want to ask you, but let's move on. So I want to start to talk to you about The Apple Trees at Halima, your new and selected poem. So what struck me again and again reading it is a certain tenderness that feels to me that underlies, even, I always want to say a certain sweetness. I don't mean that in the sort of saccharine sense, but a tenderness, a certain sweetness underlying the poetry. And it brought to mind a definition of poetry that Tom Gunn said his teacher Ivor Winters used, that the poem is a statement in words about human experience with moral import. A statement in words about human experience with moral import. And that's what I felt very much about your work. I don't know whether that resonates with you, a statement of human experience of moral import.
Tom Gunn was my colleague at Berkeley, so he was, English poetry was well represented in our, but I was not a student of Ivor Winters as he was, but I took a course from Ivor Winters, who was one of the most influential poet critics of the 30s, 40s generation, kind of an amazing man, and as a teacher, a moral bully. He made, so I heard him in the first day of the first class I took from him give that definition.
Oh, really?
And I resisted the idea that poetry had moral import. And I didn't have a language for what I objected to about it. And maybe I still don't, except to say that what I love in movies and novels, and to some extent in poems, is when life adds details that don't relate to the moral point it's making. When life is always something more than its moral point and other than its moral point. And So if you're going to say the world, what the world is to you. Wallace Stevens saying it 13 ways in 13 little poems. It's something else than a moral point. Around that time, I saw the Kurosawa film Akiru. You know that movie? It's a completely great movie, and it's the actor who plays the great samurai in Seven Samurai plays an office worker who is like the insulted and the injured character out of a Russian story. He's the boring, and he walks around like this all the time, bowing down to his superiors and always being polite. And you see him in the movie, and he gets in about the third scene a cancer diagnosis, and he knows he's going to die, and he's slowly through the first half of the movie going around the same routine that he'd been in. He stands up straight. Halfway through the movie, he's standing up straight, just looking at the way people behave, the way we all behave, like wind-up monkeys all the time, running about doing our stuff. And after a while, instead of bowing down, he's just noticing it. Eyes completely clear, just taking it in. And in the second half of the movie, compassion starts to bend him over. Just sorrow for the way people behave in the world. And by the end of the movie, he's bent over again. And it has the opposite meaning of what it did the first time. And I took that to be a way to, something different than moral meaning, but a way to try to understand and describe the world.
And that bowing is very much in your work. I mean, the thing that, I'm going to have to throw my notes away, the thing that's really striking me is just how much there is in your work with which sort of you relish the world, don't you? You place an incredible sense of relishing of things around you, anything you seem to be able to relish. Everywhere, when I read your poems, I keep thinking, if I was Robert Hass, I could write a poem about this. You know, whether it's having a cup of tea, being on a train, being in the lavatory, picking my nose. You know, I could write, if I was you, I could write this relishing of everything in a way, without hierarchy. And then you set that aside, a real testament of horror, don't you? A historical horror. You seem to want to put everything in.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, they're different. Different people have different jobs in poetry, and one of the ways of saying the world is saying the simplest possible thing, and then another way is to try to say everything. Another way of saying, there's a lovely essay by an American critic named Leslie Fiedler, who points out that when Provençal poetry, when the first poetry in modern European languages appear in the south of France, there are 8 poems. The first poems in a modern European language are 8 poems by a guy named William of Poitiers, I guess, Guillaume de Poitiers. And there are 8 of the poems, and 4 of them are riddles, and 4 of them are pornographic boasts. Thus dividing up poetry between its 2 main impulses, one of which is to brag and to let it all hang out, and the other is to reveal yourself by not revealing yourself. And so my impulse is definitely more and of course for American poets that means Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson as paired impulses. And so, though I really deeply admire the Emily Dickinson kind of poetry, and I'm married to a poet who taught me that way of seeing poetry. One of my impulses certainly is to try to include as much as possible as a tactic for
saying the world.
I'm not sure I can find words for what.
It's striking that there's that sense of wanting to include everything, but then you're also translating haiku. Japanese haiku.
I was going to say, and it's also in a funny way the impulse of the haiku poets.
Right.
Is at the core of the idea of, and it came out of that really in my apprenticing myself to the idea of being a poet. I came across these poets, and I said to somebody, at the time, haiku was mainly available in America in little books put together to sell in gift shops. And so I said to someone, he mentioned something about haiku, and I said, oh yeah, the stuffed animals of poetry. And he said, you're more ignorant than I thought you were. and I said, well, I don't like them. And he said, here, I have a book for you to read. And he gave me R.H. Blythe, the first of the 4 volume of R.H. Blythe's great book, Study of Haiku. He's an Englishman who was interned by the Japanese during World War II, and he amused himself by writing a 4-volume study of haiku. And then he wrote a book on romantic poetry and haiku and spirituality. That's, I think it's called Zen Classics and English Poets. It's a wonderful book. He was an amazing man. Biography just published of him, which I haven't read. Anyway, that book opened my eyes. And one of the things the haiku poets tried to do, and it was also for me an apprenticeship with this idea of the clear image, was the ambition of the haiku is to say the whole world by saying the simplest thing about something. That is, so that the one I was quoting with our group yesterday was a poem that goes in Japanese in 17 syllables. Suma village, urine-stained quilt drying on a line. And I was saying, you don't know whether it's an infant quilt or an incontinent elder person's quilt or a sick person's quilt, but you want a definition of the word village, of that particular familial intimacy and what life is like going on. Suma village, a urine-stained quilt drying on a line. Thought, oh, okay. I see. If you could do this, other examples would be Basha, the great founder of the haiku tradition, traveled. He died at 49 when he felt and wrote as if he were very old. But around the age of 39, he quit his city life as a poetry teacher and traveled around giving poetry readings and instruction and writing Ranga, linked verse. And one of the poems that he wrote at that time has a little superscription that just goes, we stopped at a monastery and for our lodging helped with dinner. And the poem is, cool fall night, getting dinner, we peeled eggplants, cucumbers. And I thought, yes. I mean, you can't always do that. It's very hard. I mean, when you actually try to do it yourself, there's more to say about this. But so it was magic to me suddenly. And so, and then I went out and bought Japanese grammars. I didn't expect to learn Japanese, but I wanted to know enough of the grammar to know the armature of the poems, how they work.
So I want to finish by, because I want to make sure we've got time for you to read, but I want to finish by just asking you about the influence of Buddhism in your work, because obviously you've translated haiku, and reading the poems, I'm very struck, they feel very Buddhist to me. There's one of the things I noticed again and again is your capacity to seemingly, just go off the subject, wandering about, but then you connect everything up. So it's all been about one deeper thing, but you sort of pull that off as if you're just thinking about stuff. Feels very much as a Buddhist sense of interconnectedness. I don't know how much Buddhism has influenced you as a writer.
We were talking about this a bit at dinner, and I was saying that, enormously, I mean, for me, partly it was that being raised a Catholic, being a Roman Catholic in the 20th, 21st century, problematic thing, but one of the great things about it was the being taught by these Italian American nuns from San Francisco who loved the liturgy of the seasons. And one of the great things about the Christian church is its excuse me, it's ecological in that particular way, and so is haiku. It has everything to do with naming the seasons of the year, and so there was in my trying to teach myself what was the spirit of the haiku poems. I found something that satisfied what I lost when you move away from papacy and blah, 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 improbable stories, sexism. So there is that attraction. And then there's, as with Wallace Stevens and all 20th century poetry, there is the problem of what kind of spiritual practice you have after theism. And so, and then having read Gary Snyder and got sent to Kanza's Buddhist texts, and so for me it was very much an intellectual and literary experience, and the more I understood about Buddhism, the more I understood that wordlessness was important to that experience, and so it's hard to go there to that place where, but I did have, anyway, I've been a fellow traveler, I guess, rather than a conscientious practitioner of Buddhism, but it's been a sustaining way of seeing things.
Thank you very much for that.